The website for the Charitable Giving Coalition launches today. How opportune. It is www.protectgiving.org, and there you will see lots of resources for the sector on the issue of the charitable deduction, updates on all of the activities, and a toolkit for outreach. So we do encourage you to go to the coalition's website. It is interesting to note that as ad hoc as the coalition was, and it was truly an informal coalition, that it is only now that we've launched a website, but it was called prioritizing and using. What we did up to that point is use the websites and the channels of the members to disseminate the message, but now we actually have this additional central location, so that's wonderful. One bit of connecting the dots I wanted to do is I listened to our panelists talk about last December and the fiscal cliff and the lessons learned there, and then thinking about what we heard from the congressional staff panel. We have a slight new layer of complexity to our messaging. During the fiscal cliff, it was really about raising revenues, and the charitable deduction was put on the table with basically the president's proposal of the 28% cap, although, as we had also heard, candidate Romney made some suggestions of a hard dollar cap as well. And that was really, I always like to say, that was kind of a numbers game, right? How are we going to raise enough money, and what are we going to use to raise it? And so it was really weighing the numbers. The new layer of complexity that I just want to add to this is tax reform. And in theory, tax reform should be about looking at what is good tax policy for our country. It sort of moves the conversation from a strict numbers game to really looking at policy. And I know in the context of tax reform, we even saw this at the Ways and Means Committee hearing that occurred on February 14th, which was billed as a hearing on the charitable deduction. We saw lots of other issues start to come up in the context of the Q&A. So tax reform could put lots of things on the table. Rules that are specific to private foundations, rules that are specific to public charities and the different vehicles that each uses. And so we're listening to this panel telling us to stay on message, but what do we do about that? And so what I'd like to say is that in my mind, the great transition there is to talk about your concerns about the health, well-being, and future of philanthropic giving. And it does allow an opportunity, even when walking in and perhaps opening with please protect the charitable deduction, to then talk about the diversity of the sector. Not just the diversity of the types of organizations that serve our societies, but the diversity in the vehicles that anyone can use to direct their philanthropic dollars. So whether it is directly to a charity, whether it is to a community foundation and to the vehicles that community foundations have, including donor advised funds, whether it is setting up a private foundation, these are all different vehicles that go, again, thinking of diversity a little bit differently, to the diversity of philanthropic giving. And really our concerns should be about protecting the health, well-being, and future of the philanthropic sector as a whole. And so I think that that is not in any way in opposition to the message on the charitable deduction. It is an expansion of that message of protecting this sector as a whole. It just remains, even today, even with tax reform looming, that the first headline is still the charitable deduction. So that allows you the opening comments when you walk in the door. So I've just, that was occurring to me as I was listening to the panel. I wanted to clarify a little bit about how I saw making that transition to talk about more issues, but under this common umbrella theme of health, well-being, and future. So with that, I want to see if we have any questions in the audience. Mr. Husak.
Thank
and
you.
If you could identify yourself when you speak as well. I think this is being recorded.
I am Howard Husak, Manhattan Institute Social Entrepreneurship Initiative, and I write a column for Forbes.com called Philanthropy in Society. I'd love to ask Sandra, if I might, what do you think the White House, why does the White House believe the 28% limit is a good idea? Not just what they say publicly, but what they say privately.
I can give you my perspective and then I'll shoot it down the line. I think it's about they believe that it's about fairness and equity, that wealthy individuals should not be given a greater deduction because their tax rate is greater than the individual who is paying a lower tax rate gets for this exact same donation. So to the extent that you are paying a tax rate of 39% and you give a $100 deduction, or a $100 contribution, your deduction is going to be larger than the person who's paying a 10% rate, right? And they view that that two individuals giving the exact same contribution should get the exact same benefit or similar benefit. And I think that folks on the other side believe that you're already paying a higher tax rate, so you arguably should get a higher tax benefit. So I think there's a couple things going on. You've got the fairness issue, and then I think at the heart of things, there is an appetite to raise revenue on folks who are able to pay the most, those who are wealthy. And so I think that this is it's kind of a backdoor tax increase on folks who have a higher capacity to pay.
I think I would add to that that there are two other issues at play. And I'll just start by saying that what they say publicly, I think, is also what they think is true. So take them at their word on the fact that the fiscal situation is significant, there've got to be savings, etc. I think there are two other issues here at play. One has to do with the narrative. I think that the administration very much feels that in this severe economic climate, where the challenges are as great as they are, that everyone has to pay. And I think that what we have tried to do as a coalition is make very clear that in this instance, it's the communities who pay. And so fundamental to that narrative is a misunderstanding about what you've heard said over and over again, that this is about the donors, when in fact this is about communities. And it is why we have encouraged all of us to be really strategic in articulating the impact message. Because if they can understand the impact of the donations that we get, then it flips the conversation, it flips that narrative, so it's not about the impact on the donor, it's about the impact on communities. Hence my point about unintended consequences. And then finally, I would say that there is some misunderstanding, which we can absolutely address, and I've seen us do it for months now. The misunderstanding about how important donations are. The most effective meetings that I've participated in with our CEOs as well as with many of you, whether it's been with the Romney campaign, in the administration, with House or Democratic leaders in the Congress, has been to say very plainly what our trends have been. The point that you made, Sue, about sort of broadening the conversation was actually reinforced in a conversation I had out there in the hall with one of our panelists here today, who said, I said, what is it that you don't know that you still need to know and understand much more deeply, given the fact that you've been hearing a lot from us? What still is there left for you to understand better? And she said, we need to understand the impact of the change. What are the trends? I said, well, it's hard for us to sort of predict behavior, even though many academics have tried to do so, and we are very skeptical about their ability to do that accurately. What we can do, though, is talk about what our trends have been. Our trends have been that giving increases substantially at the end of the year, which is why we know that giving is sensitive to the tax situation. What we do know is that 20%, pick your number, of the highest wage donors are giving a disproportionate amounts, and they impact our ability to plan. All of those kinds of specific conversations are helpful. And then she added as an example, out there in the hallway, okay, there's been discussion about the floor. Well, this is actively being talked about. It came up more than once. Help us understand how that plays out in your communities. And so it's the level of specificity that only you in this room can offer based on your extensive experience that will help broaden their understanding and broaden the conversation.
Let me just add one quick thing to that, because I think both answers kind of covered it, but I want to mention that the fairness issue has gotten a lot of play, and as I mentioned in my brief remarks, I talked about where does the burden of this policy change lie. But I also think it's important that you can take the argument of fairness and say, well, let's make the incentive for all taxpayers the exact same, and we end up with less giving. I mean, in the extreme, if you think about it. I think the conversation should be, how can we make the benefits for low income and middle income Americans get that incentive up to the same level that the incentive is for high income taxpayers. Now that's not a great conversation to have right now because that's a revenue loser, right? But that really should be where the conversation is. It shouldn't be about how can we reduce the incentive to make it so that we end up with less giving in the long term. So I think that's part of it. That's one of the pieces of fairness I don't think has been talked about a lot.
Can I just add one more quick thing? Hello? On the 28%, to get to Howard's question just a little bit, one thing we haven't addressed is the spending side of it. That 28% cap has been included not only in the budget proposals, but also the Jobs Act that the President proposed. It was also, I believe, in the healthcare legislation. So it's very much a spending mechanism. If you start taxing, if you cut the rate lower than 28%, you're going to start getting into families with lower incomes. And that's not exactly publicly palatable. But once you cap the rate at 28%, you're hitting the taxpayers at the 30, 35, 39% tax rates. It's fun to gang up on those people. They got loads of cash to throw around, right? So that's the two sides of it, that it's going to hit people above a certain income threshold, but it's more publicly palatable to hit, and it's also a way to gain some revenue, even though it's not a huge amount of revenue. It's significant enough that it could enable some spending.
Thank you to the panelists for that, and I wanted to just add something to Brian's comment, because on the issue of the floor, which Gloria first raised, I had a conversation with the political consultant to the Council on Foundations, Matt Dolan, about that when it came up earlier, and I said, well, what's our response right now? And he suggested the immediate response is, we like what we've got at the at the current charitable deduction. It clearly works. We're not looking to fix what is not broke. If Congress is interested, let's talk about how to expand, getting to Brian's point, how to expand and think about how to incentivize additional giving. Now, it's not your job right now to answer the revenue implications of that. That's something to be worked out. But I do think in the context of tax reform, it is helpful to think about not let's stay where we are right now, but let's get that number up. Wouldn't it be great to see charitable giving go above 2% of GDP, and what can we do to get there? And I think that's just a way of turning the conversation a little bit, again, to emphasize we care about the health, well-being, and future of the sector, and things that we can do in this broad context to encourage it to grow. So I just wanted to mention that and the advice that was given by our council as well. Other questions? Over here?
Thank you. Martha Darling, Board Chair of the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation. I wanted to ask what the play is on this particular tax expenditure. This is not a subsidy, it's a tax expenditure, and that's the category that we have to fight against. Because there are we have lots of company in that area, and we're trying to distinguish ourselves in some ways that don't make all those other folks really mad at us. But I wanted to find out what the play is about that, making that distinction, and also specifically about the value of using the Martin Feldstein editorial op-ed in the Washington Post quite recently, which really makes the case from a conservative economist's point of view, whose credibility I think cannot be challenged in this town.
I'll start off. The Feldstein op-ed that you're talking about talks about tax expenditures writ large, and talks about in some way capping or limiting them in order to raise revenue. However, it does pull out and provide an exception for the charitable deduction. That's something new. Feldstein in the past has lumped them all together. He's now changed direction and has pulled it out, which I believe is very significant. He is a strategic advisor for a number of members of Congress and at some point congressional candidates, presidential candidates. So I agree with you, very significant. I think when we talk about the charitable deduction, we shouldn't be sheepish about making the distinction between the charitable deduction and other deductions and credits. I think someone said it on the panel, we are the only deduction or credit. We are unique because we incentivize, the charitable deduction incentivizes individuals to give away their income. Every other deduction and credit in the code encourages individuals to buy something more for themselves or invest more for themselves. It is unique in that regard. I don't necessarily think we want to be in a position of pointing and saying, what about the home mortgage? What about other deductions and credits? Let's go after them. But I do think it's important in members' minds and in their offices' minds to make the distinction that we are unique. We've been doing that over the past couple of years, and that is the one message that resonates. Impact is important, but the bigger picture message about why we're unique and how we're different absolutely resonates, because what it does is in these offices' minds is it takes it out of the bucket of tax expenditures and subsidies that are up for grabs and puts it in a completely different context, and that's where we win. And we started hearing that message coming back to us last October. On the Finance Committee, Senator Hatch sat up there on the dais and talked about why the deduction is unique and how important it is. And at that moment, a light bulb went off. We're winning. When we have a member of Congress talking to us with our talking points, we're winning. And so I would urge you to make that a key talking point and then go right into your impact.
I would just add to that you know, it's helpful to also let them hear what other members, leaders have said. And so recently, Senator Wyden was quoted as saying very clearly that the charitable tax deduction is clearly not a loophole, it's a lifeline. It's not a loophole, it's a lifeline. That's somebody who understands the role that we play in communities. And I would just say, I think I made a veiled reference to this earlier, you know, that Leadership 18 CEOs, the CEOs of United Way, Catholic Charities, Goodwill Industries, many of whom are here today, have very different opinions about spending. Some of them are lobbying, advocating as vociferously on spending as they are on this issue. And they are encouraged to do so. They have their perspectives about what's important and what's not. Our organizations are human services oriented organizations by definition. And yet that does not in any way cause them to feel self-conscious about arguing the strong case for this. It's not either or for many of them, it's both and. And I think the points that were made earlier by Senator Hatch's committee about the importance of leveraging and what have you all allows some room for conversation. So we don't want to be self-conscious about being able to make our strongest case.
Sir?
Two things. One is,
So the microphone coming right behind you. Thank you.
so first, use the Protect Giving website to post those quotes so that we can find them and use them ourselves directly. And second, in the arena where bad things might happen, and so capping is one bad thing, but maybe not as bad as other bad things that might happen. What are the trade-offs that you all are thinking about so that if it comes to the point where we get a tweet from you that says, go talk about this, we understand your thinking about why one negative scenario is better than another negative scenario. We may not win everything we want.
I think from ACR's perspective, there is no trade-off. We want current law. There's absolutely no trade-off, and we're not going to be dragged into a discussion about, well, do you like credits? Do you like deductions? Do you like floors? Do you like ceilings? Our perspective is we like the current deduction the way it is because the deduction was put into the code back in 1917 as a way to take your donation out of the tax base and treat it very differently. The deduction is merely a mechanism to treat your donations as income that you've given away. The deduction was not put into the code to be an incentive. It was meant to take that income that you are donating out of your income tax base. So for us, it's very different. And so that's why we are unable at this point to say, well, we could live with a floor or we could live with a ceiling, because we view it as very different. It is unique in that regard. And it's not just unique because it's meant to provide a mechanism for people to give away. It's unique because when it was put into the code, it was really meant to take that donation and exclude it from the rest of your income. So I think other organizations may feel differently, but we feel our strongest position is not to start arguing and not to start negotiating with ourselves right now. We are firm and we're not going to change.
Thank you.
Yeah, trust me, when you go into a room with the administration or folks on the Hill, that includes the CEO of the YMCA, Goodwill Industries, Red Cross, United Way, we do get those questions, because the assumption is that there could be some trading off given the broader context, and we just have not gone there on purpose. And I don't think that that is our intent moving forward.
I think it's also important to remember that, I think Sue, you brought this up earlier, talking about, we're right now the focus is the numbers game. I mean, the numbers game is the focus right now. It's one thing if there was a larger thoughtful policy conversation happening and you were thinking about these alternatives. But as long as the conversation and the environment and the landscape is we're looking for revenue, that's not a great landscape to be talking about options related to charitable deduction. So I agree. Our strongest message should be and continue to be to preserve the charitable deduction, particularly in an environment like this.
I am very glad you raised the question, because it will not surprise me at all if you start hearing these questions in your meetings today and tomorrow. We know, because we've been up to those meetings, and we know what people will ask, because it's sort of the provocative question, right? If you can't have what you got now, what would you rather have? One answer that I have found that at least deflects it is to say most of the proposals that any congressional offices would be familiar with right now were created in the context of deficit reduction. And so therefore, all of the alternatives that have been put on the table, while they may raise money for the federal government, show a decrease in giving to charity. And that is not something that we feel we could support right now, right? We don't want less money to be coming into our organizations, we want more. So yeah, I think a good way to deflect that, at least initially, is to point out the context within which those proposals have come up. And the initial intention of those was to raise money, not to help charities. Now, I think you can add on to that, to Brian's point, if we get into a meaningful conversation around tax policy, we'd love to hear what the offices have to say. But right now, we're going to stay where we are. While it seems like you're putting up a roadblock, that response actually has worked. I don't think any of us have been in meetings where we've thought, oh, that wasn't the right response, because they get it. We're sticking on message. Any other questions? Over here.
Yeah, I just have one thought about this last point about not taking a position. I've heard people talking about the fact that this floor might be workable, maybe that's tolerable, and the fees rule is really not a big deal, but it seems to me there's a double whammy there, because at the floor level is 2% of AGI. Lower income people and those who are lesser donors are not going to have incentive to give, because they're not going to get to that level. The fees rule is very complicated. People know there's a phase out, so the people at the higher end are going to have a disincentive. And I'm afraid we're walking into the fact that, well, fees is not so bad, the floor is not so bad, when we get hit on both ends. Any thoughts on that?
You're exactly right. You're exactly right.
I think the multiple whammy answer has been a success. And when we have either been several scenarios where when you really take a look, there's multiple things happening at one time, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. It's an effective answer, because it also signals that we're a little more sophisticated than we may be taking credit for. We're actually looking at the broader scenario to figure out what's going on.
I was just going to say, you raised the fees issue, and you might get baited into talking about that tomorrow. And it's extremely complicated. I promise you don't want to get into the mathematical details. But the issue with P's is that it starts to chip away. Right now it's at 3%, it's at a certain income level, but nobody really knew about P's until after it was passed. So that would be a really easy way to gain more revenue, chip away at that without anybody knowing even what it does. It's extremely complicated. So you raise a very good point about all of these things that start chipping away at your principle of deterring giving. Over here.
Under the rubric of watching out for them, which is, there are organizations, I'm not a member of any of them, that are adamant about separation of church and state issues. Is there any danger that one of these would come forward, or are they coming forward, saying eliminate the charitable deduction for religious organizations on that ground? Is that any of that boiling up?
I haven't heard any of that of late.
No, I haven't, and I would be very surprised if that really got any traction, particularly on the Senate side of the Senator Hatch. His hearing that he had last year in October had about 3 or 4 different religious leaders, and the members were riveted. And so I think that I'm sure that there are a number of members who would put a roadblock in front of that. Most importantly, Senator Hatch.
One of our most active members of the Coalition from Leadership 18 is the CEO of Catholic Charities USA. We also have membership from Salvation Army, Lutheran Services America, and I think people are pretty aware of the impact that they're making and how devastating the change in policy would be.
Well, I think we have time for maybe one more question. I'm giving us a little extra time here. Over here.
I just wondered whether the federal government has a deficit, states have deficits, cities have deficits. Would they ever think of the nonprofit sector as collaborators? In other words, if you want this done in your district, we'll help you. I mean,
I think that
is the enemy.
That's a very, very interesting point, and one that if you look through materials that were given to you, the frequently asked questions, it's a message that we hope everyone will sort of intuitively bring, which is we're partners in the community, and that's not necessarily we're officially a partner of government. It's we're partners with the community to find solutions. And if you start to chip away at the ability, especially I think on the philanthropic organization side, the unique opportunity philanthropic organizations have to bring people together to find solutions in a highly effective and efficient way, that's a strong message. The other thing that was very surprising to me when we were around, went to our meetings in December, this Charitable Giving Day we talked about, is the message that congressmen or senators, sir, madam, you understand that the country has been in an economic decline for going on, 6, 7 years now, and the organizations, the charities in your state or in your district have done just about everything they can to work more efficiently, do more with less, all we can add on, right? We keep going on and on. There is no more that can be done, and now any cuts, any limitations go directly to the services provided. So I think that's another piece of that message to say not only can we be a partner, but also now you're starting to tie our hands to do the work that we can do.
I think it's very important to use the word constituent over and over and over instead of concert goer and student and whatever you're giving money for.
Right, they're all voters, right?
Well, I think this goes back to my point, is they're not going to take you out on a date until you let them know that you're available, right? I mean, so you have to let them know that you're there and the impact that you're making in the community, or they're not going to be aware of you. These guys have so much going on, guys and gals, in Congress have so much going on, and until you present yourself as a likely partner, they're not going to pay attention to you.
And I have to say, based on what I experienced, this person who just stood up is Exhibit A for how to do it. She was one of the people that I participated in the fly-ins with before. Remind me your first name.
Penny.
Penny, that's right, Penny. She was by far the most powerful spokesperson in our group of 6. It got to the point where by the time we went to our second meeting, we asked her to start the meeting because she was so good at being able to say, this is what I give my money to. She named dollar amounts and talked about the years of giving and why she cares so much about that giving and the impact that it has for leveraging other resources in communities at a level of specificity, transparency, and with passion that nobody else in the room could do. And I remember when we left one of our meetings, one of the staff members said, this is one of the key members on the finance committee, she said, that one, she was a real firebrand. And I said, and you know, I know that you appreciate that she represents thousands of people who can't take the time, the money, the energy to come and talk to you. There are lots and lots of pennies out there. And she said, I know, that's why these visits are so important. So I just want to say thank you for the work that you've done, and I hope that
That is a wonderful note for our panel to end on. I want to thank our panelists who joined us here today.